I am delighted to welcome Jimena Canales, who is going to speak in English, but she will take questions in French. So I hand over to Professor Canales right now.
Thank you. I apologize for speaking in English. I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I've made English my academic language. And I'm most interested in Einstein's visit to Paris, but the meeting at the Société Française de Philosophie that came after the one at the Collège de France. Yet what happened at the Collège de France served as a preface to the more livelier meeting. I'm interested in the confrontation between Einstein and Bergson. I've written one complete book about that day, about a single day and its repercussions throughout history, and in a book that's about a much shorter period of time, a tenth of a second, I also finish with a debate, particularly what Einstein and Bergson said around the comments of Henri Pierron, an experimental psychologist who had been measuring a reaction time. But a good place to historians of physics, for the most part, have ignored the debate between Einstein and Bergson, and I really think that it is the missing piece to understand his relation not only to physicists, his own peers, but also a larger intellectual and cultural sphere. For example, Bergson's comments were not included in the translated republication of the debate in the collected papers of Einstein, and the collected papers really has people who are very minor figures. So it is a bit surprising to have seen the sort of effacement of Bergson in the Einstein scholarship. A good moment to start, I think, is at the ceremony for the Nobel Prize. Einstein wasn't there, but as many of you know, he wasn't given the prize for relativity. He was given for the discovery of the law of the photoelectric effect, and also for his contributions to Brownian motion. And the presenter of the Nobel explained at the time, he said, most discussions centers on his theory of relativity, but this does not merit the prize. So why? Quote, it will be no secret that the famous philosopher Bergson in Paris has challenged his theory. The discussant goes on to say that theory, therefore, quote, pertains to epistemology, and it quote, has therefore been the subject of lively debate in philosophical circles. So that is one of the most important sort of immediate repercussions of what happened in Paris. At the time, the debate was seen as truly historic. This is the same day that the two of them met. It was also seen as a debate already, a confrontation. That was the word that was used at the end of the transcript about what had happened that evening. Bergson was much more senior than Einstein. He spoke about half an hour, and he did so because he had been prodded by a colleague who in turn had been prodded to speak by the event organizer. So there's something very fresh about what happened that day. Einstein responded in less than a minute, and in his response, he included the sentence that Elie cited, which I think is very important, and that is, il n'y a donc pas un temps de philosophe. But what Einstein said next that evening, I think, was more controversial and also gets us at the crux of what a lot of this discussion interests us, and that's the difference between psychological and physical time. So he says, there remains only a psychological time that differs from the physicists. And Bergson then responded by saying that what Einstein was doing was, quote, a metaphysics grafted upon science. It is not science. Einstein fought back against Bergson, and they did this mainly through other people, but there's lots of correspondence that traces what he thought about Bergson and that critique. Before their deaths, Bergson wrote about Einstein one last time in 1937, and Einstein mentioned Bergson in 1953 in the correspondence that has just been cited. And at that time, they still underlined just how wrong the perspective of the other remained. So while this debate has been removed from Einstein's legacy, it has been periodically been brought up by many of Bergson's followers. So there's a big difference in what the importance of this moment has been ascribed historiographically and in the scholarship. They exchanged a few more, they saw each other a few more times. They exchanged a couple of letters. Einstein sent to Bergson a very friendly postcard from Rio de Janeiro right after their encounter in Paris, and they never debated publicly again. They did this through others, through correspondence. Some of these letters reached the public because they were published by the people who received them. I believe that the encounter, the days after their encounter, created a division that is as momentous, is as important as that during the religious wars. So during the religious wars, you had people debating about how to read the Bible. In this time, we have people debating about how to read the complex unfolding of nature through time. During the meeting, Einstein was grilled about almost everything, from the mathematical details of his theory to its broader philosophical implications. The forum was very challenging for him linguistically because he was competent in French but not fluent. We all know the story of Einstein getting bad grades in school, and those bad grades actually came from his French courses. He wrote about how difficult in a number of letters. He said, "The language will cause me some trouble." One of the accounts shows Einstein and Paul Langevin whispering the answers to Einstein in France. And then he said, "I have to speak in Paris at the Collège de France. I shudder to say French. If only my beak were better polished." He said, and one of the listeners, they remarked on this. He said how Einstein pronounced relativity with two accents, relativité, and mispronounced equations by saying équation. So others that did not want to speak during the debate were prodded. One of these was Edouard Leroy, a student of Bergson, and he made this clear. He actually said "Our friend Xavier Leon really, à toute force, wants me to speak. Faced with his polite insistence, I cannot refuse, but deep down, I have nothing to say." But in the two words that uttered Leroy, Bergson was dragged into the discussion. So Leroy said that he believed, this was a sort of entente cordiale, that the point of view of philosophers and physicists were both equally legitimate but different. He said, "I believe in particular that the problem of time is not the same for Einstein and Bergson." And Leroy concluded his commentary by saying that since Bergson was amongst us, it would be more appropriate for Bergson himself to take the floor. Bergson had sat silently during the Collège de France lecture the previous day, and begrudgingly he said that he had come here to listen. He lavished praise on Einstein as a physicist, and he said that the last thing he wanted to do was to engage in a debate. He had no objections, and he said, quote, "I do not raise any objections against your theory of simultaneity any more than I do so against the theory of relativity in general." What he wanted to say was, quote, that all did not end with relativity. And he was very clear. He said, "All that I want to establish is simply this. Once we admit the theory of relativity as a physical theory, all is not finished." So Bergson's comments, as Ellie talked need to be understood as once relativity is accepted, what else can we say? It's not as simple as saying that Bergson made a mistake in his interpretation of the physics of relativity. In fact, that's part of the story that developed in the years after the debate that I dig out from the archives and from correspondence. So during the meeting with Bergson, Einstein defended his definition of time as having a clear, quote, objective meaning, and in contrast to other definitions. And this is a time where Einstein does not sound like Einstein, like the philosophy. It's a moment in which Einstein is defending objectivity. And there are many, many other quotes, the later Einstein, where he is very different in his philosophy of science, where he admits the role of metaphysics. But that was not the case during that meeting. He said there are objective events that are independent of individuals. He also fought against a conventionalist view in which his theory could have been seen as one option against others. He said, one can always choose the representation one wants if one believes that it is more comfortable to do so than the other one for the task. And this is, he's nodding towards Poincaré's conventionalism. But then he goes on and says, but that does not have any objective sense. That evening, Einstein wrote to his wife. He said, all went brilliantly well. He was holding a leather bag that was not empty. It was filled with money that had been given to him that day by the Baron de Rothschild. During his trip to Paris, he had been able to, quote, save one piece of fine soap and a tube of toothpaste. And he told his wife that he would give it to her back home. He was shocked to discover that the postage for a single letter costs 70 marks. He was going to use that sparingly. In consideration of this, he wrote to his wife, I'm not going to write very often. Back in Germany, inflation was out of control. If the Germans only knew what services I performed for them this visit, they would thank her, he told her. But they're too small-minded to grasp it, he concluded. When Einstein returned to Berlin from Paris, he found that the visit had been unforgettable, but devilishly tiring. So the debate between the two men escalated quickly. After their first meeting, they were supposed to meet again in a few months, and this was for an entirely different purpose. Bergson was the president of the International Committee of Intellectual Cooperation, which was one of the most prestigious branches of the League of Nations. Einstein was one of its members, and this part of the political story needs to enter into how we think about this debates. Also, by the beginning of the fall, the book, Bergson's book, Duration and Simultaneity, Bergson talked about it, and some of the phrases he used are reprinted almost verbatim in the book. It appeared in print. And there in the book, Bergson expressed that it was his duty to defend philosophy from the encroachment of science. And he used very strong words in the book. He said, the idea that science and philosophy are different disciplines meant to complement each other arouses the desire and also imposes on the duty to proceed to a confrontation. And this goes, I think, to speak to the obstinacy of Bergson. He really thought that it was necessary that he do this. And he chastised relativity for, quote, stopping to be a physics to become a philosophy. And that philosophy, in Bergson's mind, was naive and flawed. In the foreword to the second edition, there's also one needs to look at the different editions, the ones with the 3 appendices. In the foreword, Bergson explained the book's central message in a few lines, and he said that this was to, quote, explicitly prove that there is no difference in what concerns time between a system in motion and a system in uniform translation. Elsewhere in the book, he categorically stated that a clock traveling close to the speed of light, when is later compared to the stationary clock, quote, does not present a delay when it finds the real stationary clock. So these two claims, if they're taken in isolation, are completely at odds with the concept of time dilation. But Bergson capitalized time in those sentences in the preface. And by capitalizing the term, he was signaling readers that he was including something larger in the concept of time that he would have if he only used the lowercase. The rest of the book made it abundantly clear that he was not referring to the same category used by physicists. But most interpretations, as I've said, of the debate insist that Bergson made a mistake for this reason. So what exactly did Bergson not accept of relativity, and what did he accept about it? In a footnote to the main text, he said that he fully accepted, quote, the invariance of the electromagnetic equations. So how can one accept the invariance of electromagnetic equations and not time dilation? That again goes to him discussing something more than the physicist's time when he talked about time. And he was very clear that he had absolutely no qualms with any of the technical results or conclusions. He just thought that the technical results weren't getting to his point that interested. He said, the theory was studied with the aim of responding to a question posed by a philosopher, no longer by a physicist. And he said, physics was not responsible for answering that question, the question that interested him. So this is something he also said himself, that the statement that there was no difference between the time of a system in motion and one stationary should not be taken literally. In a letter to Lorentz, he said, it is just a manner of explaining oneself to get to, quote, the depth of the matter. So the opening sentence of the book, Duration and Simultaneity, stated that he would not go against any of the facts of observation. In fact, what is very surprising is to see how much he wanted to stick to the actual formulas and to the experimental results, even more than Einstein himself. In particular, he wanted to do a more narrow interpretation of the famous Michelson-Morley experiment, and he did this in conversation with Michelson himself, and Michelson himself was, he wrote that he was completely surprised to see Einstein interpreting his experiment in that way and having his experiment retrospectively be seen as important for the theory of relativity. So Bergson said, we take the formulas term by term and we find out to which concrete reality, to what thing perceived or perceptible each term corresponds. And he wanted you to follow his argument with a pen and paper. And this is what I think is his duty as a philosopher, to sort of rein back and say, where is it that Einstein is talking about what he calls the really real, the immediately perceptible, and where is it that he's not? So Bergson supposedly wanted to place more and not less weight on experiments and mathematics. He said, he objected to philosophical extensions of relativity. He said, physics could do a service to philosophy by abandoning certain ways of speaking that induce philosophy in error and that risk confusing physicists themselves about the metaphysical significance of their view. These confused way of speaking came from people who wanted, and this was Einstein, and this is what he objected, to transform this physics tel quel into philosophy. He was like, no, there's a gap here. So Bergson searched for a more basic definition of simultaneity, one that found it absurd to define time in terms of clocks. He wanted to know why we used clocks in the first place, why they were built, why they were invented. It was this more basic concept of simultaneity that explained their prevalence. Otherwise, he said, clocks would serve no purpose. nobody would fabricate them, or at least nobody would buy them. So this is what he was trying to get out. He said, otherwise there would be bits of machinery with which we would amuse ourselves by comparing them with one another. They would not be employed for classifying events. In short, they would exist for their own sake and not to serve us. They would lose their raison d'être for the theoretician of relativity as for everybody else. For he too, the theoretician of relativity, calls them in only to designate the time of an event. So the way of understanding for Bergson was events that commanded our attention and that were meaningful. And therefore, certain correspondences in the universe could be signaled out because they were significant for us, while most of the others were not and basically just disappeared. So Einstein's work, in his view, functioned as a sign that appealed to this more basic, natural, and intuitive concept of simultaneity. As Bergson scholars know, Bergson had been thinking about this for many years. Back in 1889, he wrote one of his first statements about clocks and how useless they were for measuring time. He said that something different, something novel, something important, something emergent, something heterogeneous had to come from outside in order for the clock to serve a purpose. He said, let us say that in duration, considered as a creative evolution, there is a perpetual creation of possibility and not only of reality. And Einstein, during the duration of simultaneity, his big mistake was actually, and this is how he ended the book, that he was a continuator of Descartes. So it was the Cartesian metaphysics that was hiding itself in Einstein's theory that Bergson protested. So months after the debate, Einstein wrote a letter to Lord Haldane, who had just written a book on relativity. He had finally, quote, received the Bergson book and read part of it, but have not yet been able to make up my mind about it. But later that fall, he finally found time to read it more carefully. He brought Bergson's book with him to read during his long trip from Marseille to Japan. And the day that the ship exited the harbor, he started reading because a major racket woke him up early in the morning. The crew was scrubbing down the vessel. So he jotted these notes in his travel journal. He said, you know, the philosophers constantly dance around the dichotomy, the psychologically real and the physically real, and differ only in evaluations in this regard. He saw the philosophers as cyclically caught in an eternal debate between basically idealism and materialism. And he said there in his notes that Bergson had, and I quote, grasped the substance of relativity. He did not find any mistake in the book, but that he was attempting to objectivize psychological aspects of time. And this was really a very quick sort of, they're scrubbing the boat, I'm on my way to Japan, reading of duration of simultaneity, and not really knowing much of Bergson's philosophy, not at that time. And Bergson wrote to friends. He said, "I don't think that Einstein understands what I'm saying or what I'm coming from." So let's go back to a little bit to that division between the psychological and the physical, and goes to the question of what is the role of the brain or the mind in creating the subjective way of understanding time. So during the debate, Einstein said that the subjective understanding of time was, quote, nothing but a mental construct. They were logical entities that did not exist objectively. Again, a strange Einstein in terms of his later philosophy of science. As Ali went, Bergson was criticized for his interpretation of the twin paradox, But again, that's something that we cannot just stay at duration or simultaneity, not stay at what was said during the debate, but to look at later articles. In particular, one of Bergson's most important articles appeared 2 years later, and this is Le Temps Fictif and Le Temps Réel in May 1924. And it is in those articles that Bergson acknowledged the discrepancy in the times, but said that that discrepancy arose because there was a difference. Somewhere there was a difference. It could be a difference of acceleration, but it could be just a difference in the length of the paths. So he objected to the idea that these times should be given absolute weight and that they were absolutely reciprocal. So if something's absolutely reciprocal, then there shouldn't be a difference. It's almost a rhetorical point. And if there's a difference, then things are not absolutely reciprocal. His objection was very logical in that sense. Okay, so and you know, as in the book, one has to look what happened before, what happened after the debate in order to get a full picture. And an important moment before the debate was a previous meeting in the winter of 1921, and that's where Langevin discussed with Painlevé. And already that Christmas, before Einstein and Bergson met, they already saw these two sides forming each other, with Painlevé arguing that against the absolute reciprocity of the times, and Langevin in favor for that. And Einstein was very interested about what happened in the meeting and asked his friends to tell him. And then the other obvious reference, the ghost in the room who was mentioned at the introduction of the meeting at the Société Française de Philosophie was Poincaré. And lots has been written about the relation between Einstein and Poincaré, but really Bergson there is an important missing piece. For example, in 1912, 2 months before Poincaré died, he delivered his final lecture on relativity, and he did not even mention Einstein. So one of the reasons that he did not mention Einstein was because he believed that many of the contributions of relativity had been carried out and worked by Lorentz. So we have, what's very interesting for me is that we have the three most important scientists to know relativity and to work on it. Einstein said at the time of the general theory that there were only about 12 people who could understand him, and if three of those would surely be Henri Poincaré, Henri Lorentz, and Michelson. And the three of them were corresponding with Bergson. Bergson saw his contribution as fitting with their comments, and the three of them ended up not accepting certain aspects of Einstein's interpretation of the relativity equations and Einstein's interpretation of the Michelson experiment. So, for example, Poincaré wrote many letters for Lorentz, wanting him to get the Nobel Prize, and he attributed to Lorentz the idea, quote, that it's impossible to detect anything other than relative velocities of bodies with regard to one another, and we should also renounce the knowledge of the relative velocities with regard to the ether as much as their absolute velocity. So the general view is that neither Poincaré, neither Lorentz, neither Bergson understood the importance of what they were working on, and obviously this is more complicated. The question of Einstein's priority is clear. He deserves absolute credit, and this was worked out during the years, because it was only Einstein that wanted to eliminate the privileged frames of reference. So this is one of the reasons why one can accept the invariance of the electromagnetic equations, as Lorentz did, but not accept fully Einstein's interpretation. of those equations and the experimental evidence. So another sentence is evidence for this is in 1902 we have Poincaré nominating Lorentz for the Nobel Prize, and Lorentz indeed won it. And the letter of recommendation, this is 1902, so 3 years before the 1905 famous paper, and Poincaré says that the prize should be given for Lorentz for the ingenious invention of reduced time, where, quote, everything happens as if the clock in one place slows down in comparison to the other. Lorentz, wrote Poincaré, also said that there, quote, is no conceivable experiment that can lead us to discover these differences between time. And he also credited Lorentz for changing the concept of simultaneity. He said this was the surprising discovery of Lorentz that explained why, quote, two phenomena occurring in two different places can appear simultaneous even though they are not. So it is in this context that we need to understand Bergson's contributions. As I said, Bergson knew Michelson well, and Michelson had actually been invited a year earlier to the Société Française de Philosophie, the same forum of this debate that occurred in the spring of 1921. And at the time, Bergson met him, and he wrote to Javier León. He said, I had a conversation with him that interested me greatly. There's the context of the International Commission of Intellectual Cooperation, and that is important not only because of their political views, but because these big institutions were actually involved in practical efforts for time standardization and time coordination. So you have Bergson being the president of the IC, Einstein protesting the role of the League of Nations for many reasons, but the consequences is that a different council, the International Research Council, the IRC, ended up taking the role of standardization of time and of the unit of time. And it was that institution, together with the Astronomical Union, that ended up setting up the Committee on Standards of Wavelengths, which was a decision that was gave an importance to the understanding of time in terms of the light clock. It sort of made it practically relevant in practice. So there are many intellectuals that reference specifically this meeting, and I can't talk about most of them. There's Bachelard in the US, George Herbert Mead, one of the most important representatives of American pragmatism, wrote a lot about that debate. We have Whitehead, we have Deleuze, Latour. I will say a little bit about Ernst Cassirer, another very important person to enter here, and there's an interesting anecdote when apparently Hermann Cohen, the German philosopher, was writing about a book about science in philosophy and arguing that the place of philosophy, of science with respect to science, was to provide an epistemological framework. He wrote, it was very vicious against Bergson, was very angry towards Bergson's philosophy, and Cassirer read it, and he called Hermann Cohen and said, you really need to tone this down. So he telephoned Einstein, and in an intimate and tender voice, Cohen's wife, Cassirer's wife, got on the other receiver and listened into the conversation. The critique was changed to the most trivial, most insignificant, and most garrulous that I have ever read. And the wife just absolutely burst into laughter after hearing Cassirer's advice. Another a key moment is Heidegger's Being in Time, published in 1924, a few days after this debate. And in later work, Heidegger, retrospectively, he explains why he chose the title Being in Time. And he says time there, he says, quote, as regards to the title Being in Time, time means neither the calculated time of the clock nor lived time in the sense of Bergson and others. So it is absolutely important to read, when we read Heidegger, to look at it in terms of what happened in 1922, and even the later debate between Heidegger and Cassirer in Davos, which has received a lot of attention from philosophers, should be traced back to what happened here. An important person, of course, there is Husserl's in relation to Heidegger and the difference between Husserl's phenomenology and Bergsonian philosophy. Merleau-Ponty, much later, also finds the reason why he finds the debate most important is due to the role of the role of intellectuals in society. And he's very explicit. He actually takes us back. He says, on April 6, 1922, Einstein met Bergson at the Philosophical Society of Paris. And he criticized this overriding scientism, and especially the separation between the truths of science and the truth of experience and sensorial experience. He said, quote, the experience of the perceived world with its obvious facts is no more than a stutter that precedes the clear speech of science. So this introduces an important challenge from that moment on to Deleuze and to now about what is the role of philosophers vis-a-vis science, in particular what is the role of philosophers vis-a-vis the actual results and the content of science, and if it's going to be reduced, as Herman wanted, to providing an epistemological framework or just giving a commentary on it. Okay, so I'm running out of time. Just want to say a few things. That the changing material context, the role of recording devices, enters centrally in the discussion. So we need to think about the radical changes in how things were measured during that period. From the in very broad strokes, in the 19th century, most measurements were done with a lever or a dial in which you compared certain things. And in the world of electromagnetic communications, you started having most comparisons be exactly the way that Ellie mentioned it, a comparison of two signals reaching a point. So there's a whole media history of the media transformation of measurement that informs these philosophical answers and this division between philosophy and science. So I'll say a little bit about Bergson's last words about Einstein. And this is, I'm concluding now. He was writing in 1937. He was 78 years old. He wrote a long note that he sent to the Descartes Congress, once again closing the circle of having called Einstein the continuator of Descartes. During the Descartes Congress, he talked about Einstein. He first apologized. He was too sick to attend. And he explained how, when thinking about Descartes, he was immediately reminded of Einstein. He said how Einstein was brilliant, savvy, ambitious. Einstein was driven as much by discipline as by pleasure. Einstein was a man who quote, practiced grand tourism, covering first as a soldier for science and then for his own pleasure, Germany, Hungary, Switzerland, Holland, and even more countries, end of quote. Einstein accused of Einstein having used the League of Nations not for the intended purpose of promoting relations amongst scientists, but primarily for networking, for his own advantage. He said he used it, quote, to get in contact with scientists all over the world, corresponding with a princess lecturing to a queen. And he said that, yes, that sometimes he did think as Einstein deep in thought, a thinking man, but he was mostly remembered him as somewhat of an action hero. He said, I also see him on a ship where the crew conspired to steal and to throw overboard, anticipating them, and drawing his sword to hold back the bandits. So the scene that he described was like those that could be seen in those new blockbuster and propaganda movies. And Einstein then went on to, Bergson went on to say that Einstein had lived his life in order to produce, quote, a maximum effect. And going to America was a part of this. Einstein's last mentions of Bergson, when one of the letters came in, occurred in a Christmas Eve. He was around 67 years old, and his friend Besso wrote to him, asking him of whether the question of what is so strangely compelling about the passing of time is ever on your mind. He anticipated that Einstein might get hurt by him even posing that question, and he wrote, "Forgive your dear Michel, who is now truly old," for bringing this topic. Einstein answered nicely. He said that he also was already quite musty. And he was motivated by Besso's allusion to subjective experience. He said, he rephrased Besso's question. He said, you say that this passage of time is accompanied by suffering, which, if one interprets it as a physicist, is tied to irreversible processes. He said, I do not know how to help you. Noting that the difference between how one experienced present, future was, again, limited to the subjective perspective. And he said, this is what bothered Bergson the most. In subsequent letters, it becomes clear that Einstein could not convince his friend, and again, he cited Bergson once again, and he said, you cannot get used to the idea that subjective time with its own now should not have any objective meaning. See Bergson. So I see in this debate a story of a split century in which you have a growing division between the scientists and the humanities. This is a century that sees the rise in the authority of the scientist as somebody who speaks about not only questions of time, but politics. And in looking at the debate and trying to do not take sides, but trying to do the most honest and complete rendition possible of both of their perspectives, the hope is that we can enter into a new century with a new relation between science and the humanities, and a new relation between science and philosophy that is not based on this acrimony, these divisions that leaves everybody unhappy. You have Einstein and Bergson as old men confused about the passage of time, and find a third route towards a new form of dialogue.
Thank you.